Unfiltered from No to Nothing Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a doctoral student in psychology, and with me today is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. Last week, we dove headlong into the idea of color, and while there, we found a uniting element with the previous show, symmetry. Much as the two concepts just mentioned are philosophically elegant in their ability to be both abstract and concrete, today's topic is similar and thus quite mind-bending. Just as one light spectrum contains infinite colors, and just as a simple line can be as symmetrical as a complex fractal, so too can harmony be both one and many. So harmony, we kind of stumbled upon that one at the end of last week's episode. I still cannot remember the other one that I had.
Oh, dear. Yeah.
But I'm sure, sometime down the road we'll stumble upon it. But yeah, so harmony. Is there a way of adequately describing what harmony is?
No. My son, the music teacher and composer, will be desperately disillusioned by that response. So, on the surface of it, I'd have to, because there are so many different applications of the term. But I think that if we go with the idea that harmony is a balancing of parts to create an integrative whole. How's that first start?
Okay. Yeah, and I think that's a pretty good description. But it's going to raise a lot of questions we'll see as we get going along. So, have philosophers thought about harmony?
Since the beginning. Aristotle, Plato. I mean, if we go to Socrates said, a harmony cannot be in a state other than that of the elements out of which it is compounded. Which in itself is a huge conversation. So a harmony cannot be in a state other than what the individual elements intended things to be. So it's kind of if not a determinism there. This goes back to our talk last week in a sense. If you break human beings down into our constitutive water, carbon, oxygen, so on, put them in nice little tubes next to each other. That's not a human, but those are the compositions of the human. And so he's sort of saying that.
Yeah. And this really does go well with what I've been studying, which is human development. And I had a pretty interesting discussion in my class this past week talking about the same thing, which was the specific theory that we're studying, relational developmental systems, sort of touts itself as being an integrative theory. So, I've talked about it the past couple episodes, so I won't get into it a lot, but you have mechanistic theories, sort of deterministic ones, that say, okay, everybody's made up of molecules and elements, and since the Big Bang, everything got thrown in motion, and so it's just continuing the way it is. And then you have, other theories that say, as you grow up, you mature, and so you necessarily progress through these steps. There's this sort of deterministic feel to them. And relational developmental system says, it's really not this either or scenario, rather than these Cartesian splits. Each one integrates things. You have your genes, and you're limited by your genes to an extent, but really, your genes don't predict your behavior. Your environment determines which genes get flipped on and off.
Yes.
And even the person themselves is a source of their own development. So I just talked about this with Kevin Palmieri yesterday. Because of our ability to self-reflect and have metacognition, the sort of narratives that we have about ourselves determine in what ways we develop. And so, it has this, it gives people more autonomy over their own development, over the life course, and really what I like about it is that it doesn't focus so much on childhood, just saying that, okay, well, human development happens in the first 2 decades of life and everything after that is just whatever, right? They say, no, humans have a remarkable plasticity your ability to respond and learn and change over your lifetime is vast. And so the discussion that I had in the class with another student was, you know, he was talking about, you know, the fact that he liked it because it wasn't a deterministic theory. And I said, well, in what ways is it not deterministic, right? Because in my mind, right, even though it's integrative and it appears to give somebody free will, I think that where things become deterministic is almost once we give them a scientific basis, right? Once you start empirically examining something, it almost necessarily becomes reductionistic. And once you get to that point, it almost necessarily becomes deterministic. So, yeah, and that brings up what we're talking about with harmony is like you were talking about. Are we just harmonious, sort of extensions of the universe in the way that our atoms and molecules and fibers and all of the other things sort of, work together to be the one continuous sort of creature that we are? Or are we a distinct thing, right? Am I just one thing? I'm me, or am I really just a harmony of an infinite number, subset of things? Not infinite, but a huge subset of things that are all working together in harmony. But really, me is just an illusion, right?
Yeah. So there are those who have said that essentially that we are the way that the universe senses itself. So we become the sense organs for the universe. And you said something very similar to that a moment ago. Pythagoras says that everything having to do with harmony and order is reducible to a mathematical principle. And music and math are very related, inarguably, right? And the oscillations of sound in music and so, but there's so many, and we were talking about this before the show, really. I mean, there are at least 6 different major subcategories that we could talk about in terms of harmony: aesthetics and sociopolitics and psychology, if you just brought up, and music and philosophy itself, where you seek harmony. So it may not be that we're all in harmony, but the ancients seem to suggest that we tend toward it.
Yeah. So it's going to be a complicated conversation for sure. So does the concept of harmony necessitate component pieces?
Man, that's an interesting question, because if you go with, let's start with Pythagoras and Socrates. If you go with the idea that math as a divine principle, well, math is numbers. What the numbers do, I mean, I'm oversimplifying, but what the numbers do would then lead to the harmonic whole. So I guess to Leibniz, but I'm not even going to talk about Leibniz.
Yeah, I think that it might help us if we take a little bit of an aside. So I'll ask a different question first. Is harmony just mathematical? Do you think it's an association of numbers, and the manifestation of that mathematics in our physical reality is what leads to harmony?
I don't think so, because I find Pythagoras' eccentricity sort of. I was never good at math, so I'll just take an easy shot right now. But no, seriously, I don't think that everything is reducible to numbers. Now, computer programmers would be laughing at me, I suppose, for saying so, and algorithm writers.
Yeah, Sabine Hassenfelder had a chapter in her book. Is everything math?
Is everything math? It may be stubbornly humanistic of me to say that, well, no, And because I'll jump to Leibniz, even though we don't. So there's Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, mid 1600s, early 1700s time frame, was working with the idea of harmony along with many other things, and essentially was breaking down the possibilities for harmony and severely reducing it, and therefore not absolutely accurately. He would suggest that if applying this, if a guitarist were playing a harmonic tune, and his fingers, or her fingers, their fingers, would not actually be stroking the strings before the strings already were aligned to do what the intent was. So that there is an intramural, an intra kind of thing going on within the object or the subject itself. It's very complicated, but and it's interesting, but I don't find that resonating.
Yeah. So I think that probably what he's trying to say is there's no harmony without melody. You have to have some note first, right?
But he says, but it emerges from the strings. The fingers don't actually touch the strings until the strings already know the sound that's going to be made.
Huh. Okay. All right. Yeah. Maybe I'll try asking this a different question. I'll try asking it a different way. We can say some harmony is mathematical, right? I think that's pretty safe to say.
Yes.
So maybe we'll help clarify this question, which is, does the concept of harmony necessitate component pieces? If we take a mathematical concept of harmony, I think the question would be, is it the numbers that make up the harmony, or is it the mathematics? Is it the equation? And I think that might sort of determine whether or not the component pieces exist.
If we could take one step further and call it make it a formula rather than equation, I think so. Because when Plato was talking about harmony, and he got to the more human component, and said any conflicting interests between the different parts of humanity can be harmonized. Well, when you're talking about the different parts of humanity, you're talking about a diversity of human beings. And while Plato's idea of diversity is certainly not ours, it just is all the more important now. So I don't think that, I mean, if we looked at straight numbers, and this is why I'm going with your equation or even formula thing, if we did straight numbers, all we would do is say, well, there's just a certain number of people, and so their needs can be reducible and not put in the formula nearly as much as the needs of a larger group of people. I don't think at our best we do that. I think we try to look at, when we are at our best, the needs of everyone. But there is a kind of nascent utilitarianism in the idea of using numbers to do that.
Yeah. I find this to be an interesting sort of point, because I think that the way that we use language sometimes leads us to think that maybe harmony doesn't have component pieces so much as being, well, because I mean, somebody could say, like, could you say that you're at harmony with yourself, that you have a sense of harmony within yourself, right?
You could say that, but even that, I think the component pieces, which is why I'm dancing around this with the numbers, Joel. This is a fascinating question. Harmony has been presented in so many ways, and one of the most ancient going at it from the East, not just from the West, is to emphasize that harmony is not sameness. Harmony is not neutrality. Harmony is not blandness. And harmony isn't even a lack of conflict. It's integrating things into a less conflicting and more perhaps acceptable or less itchy, angry hole.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. So music is a really good example, right? Because I think if you think about this musically, sometimes you can have this harmony. A guitar is just a good example. You have 6 strings, so if you strum it, you're almost necessarily making some kind of harmony. The strings are you're plucking 6 different notes, and the notes might be the same, but they might be in different octaves even. But regardless, every time you strum a guitar, you're making a harmony. Some of those harmonies sound really good. You can have a major or a minor or a seventh or whatever, but you can have dissonant harmonies too. And sometimes a dissonant harmony might sound really bad. If somebody who's never played before just frets, a couple random strings and strums it, you might go, oh, I don't like that. But there are other times where a dissonant chord can really add a feeling to a song. And I like using these in my music. You can't use them all the time or back to back or this sort of thing. But sometimes if you just sneak one in an otherwise pleasant harmonic phrase, it gives the music mysterious or dreamy or airy sort of feel.
Yes.
That gives it this separation from just it makes it less bland, right?
Okay. So it's a pleasing effect. It's not necessarily a somnambulant effect. It's not pleasing in the sense of, oh, that's going to relax me and put me to sleep. Although some harmonies can do that. But the idea of pleasing makes a complication.
Yes, because those specific chords are pleasing in that they create tension that is then resolved by a less dissonant chord later on.
Yeah.
So in that case, it's not that it's pleasing in the sense that it's relaxing, but it's actually just the opposite. It's exciting. It's something that makes you want to listen closer. Now you need to hear what the resolution to it's going to be.
So you're actively involved, you're seeking, you're engaging. But for some of us, that's a pleasing thing. I mean, my dear friend who I talk with about theater every week, who applied the craft of dramaturgy and dramatic intention and studying text for decades. We talk often about how audiences will go to a show and just want to be entertained. But if you go to a dramatic production and the playwright has written it in such a way that the expectation is that you're going to be engaged and you're going to be thinking about it and you're going to be doing work with the actors, there is a section of populace that doesn't want that. None of us wants that probably every single moment either. If I go to see Quantumania, which I will, I don't expect I'll be thinking storylines and so on, but I'm going to be entertained. But I'm also going to see perhaps a dim echo of ancient quest stories. Okay, but sure, colors and sequences, and scripts, and all. So I think there's an engagement in what you were talking about with music that I think is true aesthetically in art. When I make a piece, and if it's about conflict that I feel or that I sense or have an impression or even a surrealistic expression of within a person or within a culture, I hope that it's engaging, but I don't look at it. I didn't want to just make something that was just, oh, well, that's a nice flower. Because to me, that's not how I think of as art. If my own eyes can be engaged by what I've done and not in a narcissistic way, but I look at it and say, wow, okay, I didn't realize that was there. That to me is a harmony.
Yeah, so it's almost as if things could be so harmonious that they're no longer appealing due to a disengagement. And I think that is contextual. I think that something that might be bland or disengaging in one setting might be engaging in another setting.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's sort of the goal or the difficulty in being an artist, is finding out in which situation you should be employing each method.
Yep.
So this idea of if harmony necessitates component pieces is obviously a really difficult question. So let's make it harder. Rather than component pieces, do you think harmony necessitates separate pieces? So with the guitar, right, is the string a separate piece? Is it a component piece or is it a separate piece? With your paints, when you put them on the canvas, are they separate pieces or are they a component piece? Is harmony, several pieces that are connected and working together as a component, or are they a bunch of things that are separate that are working together?
Okay, I'm going to start with the art part first, because as an artist, once one has created a piece and it's in a position that one wishes to sign it, one usually gives it some kind of name, and then in a parenthetical note underneath lists. So I just did one of this past week that I said the dimensions of the piece, 3 feet by 5 feet, acrylic on brown crumpled paper, and then you go on and do the different kinds of things with, if there's digital enhancement or digital filters or whatever. So essentially what you're doing is saying, here's the name of the piece. Here's the piece. This is the entirety. But here's a name for it, which might limit and affect what you're seeing in the piece. Here's what I made the piece of, if you're really interested. And so that can take you down to thinking of those and saying, wait a minute, I didn't even see that in there. Now I'm looking for the piece. Because, and one of them I said, I made a number this week, and one of them was photographs that I had used and then tore the photographs into small pieces and then I worked them into the paint. So there's photographs, but what you could then say is just photographic paper worked into the paint, because it's not even a photograph anymore. But the fact that it was a photograph, to me, has something to do with what it's saying about the subject. So yes, they're individual pieces, but individual pieces aren't the art.
Okay, so you think that harmony has separate pieces working together?
Yes, they make a whole, but they can still be discerned perhaps separately.
Okay, yeah, you see, I think that this is a really difficult question now, because I think that it might even vary from thing to thing. Because with the guitar, right? So if I take the strings off, do I still have a guitar? I don't know that I do, because if you have no strings, then the guitar can't function how it's supposed to. So, and if you have a string by itself, it's not good for much. You can't create music with just a string. I mean, you could put some tension on it and try to pick, but you're only going to get one note tone out of it unless you're trying to adjust the length or free fret it or something. So with a guitar, I almost think that, are they separate pieces? Sure, a string is a separate thing from the body and neck of a guitar, but I think that in order to have a guitar, those two things are component pieces.
Yes.
Whereas, and I think that the human body is another good example, right? Like, I mean, is a kidney a separate thing from the body? Sure, like you can have a kidney by itself, but what does a kidney do by itself with no body? It does nothing, right? It's useless. With art, it's a little bit different, right? Because if you're using a photograph by itself does have a purpose. It does serve a purpose. And then you're integrating it as part of your whole. So in your situation, I think that you're right. I think that you have separate pieces that you are then using to create a harmony. But I think in other cases, the pieces might not be separate. They might be necessarily components, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, well, and I think it's probably good to be not sure because of those different circumstances. Let's take the same question, put it to something else.
I think with philosophy, right, we're always looking at initial conceptions or the basics. We're the sort of the root of science. So we are looking to reduce things as much as we can to try to get at the truth of what reality is. So when we look at that, right, are atoms component pieces of the universe, or are they separate pieces of the universe? And not, and of course, we know atoms aren't even the smallest piece. If we go down farther, then it gets even more interesting into the quantum level, right? We start looking at quarks or neutrinos or dark matter. Then it really becomes hard to tell, because in some scientific theories, those pieces or gravitons, right, are not limited by the spatial dimensions or the time dimensions of the universe. And so if they're not limited by the dimensions of the universe, then they would seem to be separate pieces and not component pieces, right?
Yeah.
So
let's go back to, remember we talked a few weeks ago about the question would be, does it matter? Well, matter matters.
Yeah.
and does, yes, it matters that I'm not a separate collection of tubes, beakers of stuff. I mean, there was a Star Trek episode once, it's such old series, comes to mind, where an alien is, of course, trying to take over the ship, and what it does is reduces the crewmen and the people, mostly on the ship, almost all of the crew, are reduced to these little, it looks like little styrofoam cubes. They had all kinds of different colors of them and dots and stuff. And then just to show that he was serious, the alien picked up one of the cubes and crushed it, and all the dust went to the ground. And Captain Kirk is looking at it, and the alien brings back, reconstitutes the other person. So one crewman has been killed to prove to the captain that the alien's in charge. But when broken down in its constituent elements, it couldn't be reconstituted. And we've talked about entropy and whether entropy can reverse all that. And Sabine did that too in her book. So I think it's important to realize what goes into a piece of art, or what goes into a piece of music from the intellectual viewpoint, from training oneself or being taught and trained to do so. But ultimately, it's the piece itself and as it works. I love jazz and blues, and jazz. You have so many constitutive elements that just oscillate with each other and work with each other to create this unique piece that, even if it's replicated somewhere else, it's just a little bit different because of the players and the instruments.
Yeah, and I think the important concept, and this is something that is debated on the scientific level, and in what I'm doing as well, is this idea of emergent properties, right? So when you have additive versus multiplicative versions of how reality works. So if it's additive, then, if you just add up enough atoms and molecules and chemicals and fibers and stuff, you get a human being. But like the example we've used for the past couple of weeks, water, right? When you add hydrogen and oxygen, two gases, all of a sudden you get this new emergent property of liquid, right? Where does that come from? And so, yeah, there's something weird going on when these things start acting in harmony, when they start being linked. And the question, whether they're separate things that are just put together and working together, or whether they're components, right? There are two things that meet, and now they are linked in such a way that they operate as one is kind of an interesting
I think, yes. And I think that there's if not a tentativeness, there is always the possibility that the things will stop working together. Peace is not the absence of war. It is an active work toward a harmony. Okay. And with a classic painting, we know that pollution, air pollution, and how many numbers of visitors and everything that's in the air can affect the quality of the paint. Paint disintegrates. And so it has to be retouched or carefully taken care of, curated in a a chemical way, which sometimes can lead a painting to go back to supposedly looking as it must have looked way back when, hundreds of years ago. We don't know that absolutely, but we're still approximating. But there's always this negotiation, I think, going on.
Yeah.
I mean, if I do a piece of work and it's on brown crumpled paper, I know it's not going to look that way for decades. I'm making it for myself primarily. I'm making it for very few eyes. But I also know that it'll start, it's acrylic paint. It's going to start breaking and chipping. And so one could think of it as, yep. And so the art is still transforming, even if the paint isn't just slogged onto paper and there it is, and nothing more happens to it. Some people do art realizing that process. And I think that's true of sound, and I think it's true of politics, and I think it's true of human beings with psychology. We don't think we're just static. Oh, well, now I've made it. I've reached the top of Maslow's ladder. I have nothing more to do. Well, then, as you've said before, if we stop moving, we're done.
Yeah. We see it. I mean, we see it all the time, even, with light, right? If you look out to the edges of the universe, everything is redshifted.
Yeah.
Everything is stretched out. Things change. I was just reading an interesting article on the terracotta army in China. Mm-hmm. They said that each one they uncover they're painted. A lot of people don't know that, but they're painted, and if they uncover them within minutes of being exposed to the air, the paint comes off. So they've developed a chemical solution so that as they uncover them, they coat them with it so that the paint stays on, right? And that's that idea of the art transforming, of the harmony. If you strum a guitar chord, it's not going to ring forever. It's going to resonate and then end. And as it ends, higher pitches fade out quicker and the lower pitches remain. So the harmony changes over time. So in considering harmony, do unity and balance have synonymous meanings? We've talked about unity to this point so far, thinking about separate pieces, component pieces. There's this idea of balance, the guitar is a good example, right? You have your strings and the low strings ring out for longer. So as that harmony changes, the balance of the harmony changes. But also the components that are contributing to it are changing.
Right.
So are the balance of the harmony and the unity of the harmony the same thing in this case?
I don't think they are the same thing. I think both are in process, but I think the fundamental, for me, difference between the two is that the unity implies that a whole bunch of things are working together. But unity doesn't mean that they're working together well. And a balance acknowledges process, acknowledges that things can get out of balance, which means there's a constant negotiation with whatever is contributing to that unity. So you want unity, whatever we may mean by that in a play or in a piece of music or in a government. But we also want balance. And I think even if you go to the United States at its beginning, we want to think that the founders were going for both a unity and a balance. We right now don't live in that circumstance where we are unified and where we are balanced, because balance requires that all elements are acknowledged. And not just acknowledged, but taken into the larger unity. So I think a unity in that case is more static. We can say we're all united, but a balance means that every one of us has needs that should not be ignored or attempted to be erased just because it would be simpler. Unity does not mean everyone agreeing. That's where we've forgotten. We've lost our way on it. So suddenly I'm going into this, but because I think harmony is not about utter agreement. As musicians, you've just described it. It is a give and take. It is a play, and a contribution of, and an acknowledgement of, you have this note, you have this to contribute. Other note, you have that to contribute. Or color. I know that you as a color don't technically exist. My receptors will tell me that you do. They'll fill you in somehow, and we talked about that last week. So there, even in that, there's a process. The way to have harmony is that the brain seeks it.
Yeah. Do you remember what was the definition of harmony you gave at the beginning of the show?
I think I said something like that harmony was a process of individual pieces integrated to create something.
Yeah. And so I think in that definition, I think that's very close to the definition that I looked up. It doesn't really say anything about things working together. It doesn't make any judgment on the character of the relationship, really.
Right.
Which I think is important to the discussion we were having about dissonance, right? Because I think that there's this contextual element to harmony. So, like we were saying, something that might, if I play a dissonant chord by itself, you might go, "Oh, that's not a good sound." But then if I put it in a song and I use it just once in the middle and surrounded by other more pleasant sounding chords, you might go, "Oh man, the tension that creates right there is just the perfect thing that it needed."
Yes.
Or like you were talking about with paintings, right? You could paint a very bland picture that might not be engaging in one scenario, but in another scenario or in a different light, like you were talking about with your sculpture last week. In one light, it looks like this sort of homogeneous thing that's not really, but then if you put in a different light and you let the shadows kind of take it, all of a sudden it becomes something new.
It becomes a new piece. Essentially, in my experience, a wonderful art teacher, dear old friend, who has taught me so much. But when I do a piece, like on brown paper or whatever, and with acrylics, then I adjust all the saturations and colors, and I try it in black and white. The black and white reveals things that a deeply rich color tells you something else. So one piece can become 5, 6, 7 different individual iterations of moods, thoughts, impressions, and it is because of the light. So I can't think of anything harmonic that isn't constantly in motion.
Yeah. And so I think that plays into this idea of unity and balance, right? I think so. Your sculpture is obviously unified. The unity of the piece does not change from context to context, but the balance of the piece actually does change depending on its context.
Yes.
The same thing with the dissonant chord. It's still a unified set of individual tones being played together. But although it's unified, the balance that it has is different in one context and in a different context. The one I'm thinking of, it's kind of a funny example. So I grew my hair and my beard really long for the winter. It's still winter, but I just got sick of it, so I cut it off. But I took some pictures for posterity's sake, from a few different angles, from the front, the side, and the back and stuff. And then, looking at them, you realize, oh, well, I never see myself from these angles. And so even though I'm a unified whole, you look at it and then it brings into your mind the saying that people have when they go to take pictures, like, oh, this is my good side, right? Yeah. So a good side and a bad side. Well, technically you're a unified whole as a person. So, but yet, depending on which way you're looking at the context that you're in, you see yourself as having better balance, right?
Yeah.
So, I think that probably in that sort of regard, unity and balance aren't the same thing. I think that a harmony as separate or as component pieces that make up a whole are unified. But I think that the balance of the harmony, it depends on something outside of the harmony. I think it might be the context that it's being...
It's context. It's the context of one's own judgment, or the context of a judgment of a group to which you belong, or whatever. It can move up a scale. But it is contextual.
So, do you think there are any situations where harmony is not a property of an interaction?
Not a property of the interaction.
So, let's put it this way. So, we've talked about
Interesting question.
separate pieces, component pieces, harmony. Now, you could have, do you think you could have separate or component pieces that are making up a harmonious whole without there necessarily being an interaction? Or does everything coact with some measure of agreement?
It either coacts with some measure of agreement, or it intentionally or unintentionally dismantles. Here are two examples. My wife and I watched a marvelous version of King Lear on the National Theatre out of Britain a week ago. Ian McKellen was Lear. It's just the most nuanced Lear performance that I've seen. But there are things that happen in theater, just as in literature and other, I'm sure it happened in engineering, but there are things that happen which can drop you out of the story. That's the phrase we use in theater. And there's I'm sure you've read Lear, there's this quintessential scene where King Lear, two of his daughters had betrayed him. He's divided his kingdom to three daughters. Whoever said he was the best for how they loved him most got the biggest piece. It's just fraught with problems all the way through. But he's going mad. He's on an open field in a lightning storm, rain, and he has a fool, a jester who's been staying with him. Now, this scene has been played all kinds of ways, but in this particular production, which is a filming of an actual play production, out comes Ian McKellen with the fool, and it's pouring rain. The staging, the stage design, the set design has been such that we've got a rain shower coming down in the middle, in this extended circle from the stage. And they're doing this scene in the rain. Now, there's thunder, the light flashes in the back, the lights and the thunder that have been in theater forever, acoustically better now, of course, in the 21st century. That rain really bothered me a lot because it was, to me, a directorial misstep. It was an insult to an audience. And doubly so when later on there's a scene in which an estranged son who's pretending to be crazy helps his father, who has been abused by the people in power and had his eyes taken away. And so the pretend crazy, the son, is leading the father who doesn't know he's the son. The father wants to commit suicide. He wants to go to the cliffs of Dover, essentially, a high peak, to just jump off. And he's convinced that the son takes him to the edge of, and then the stage is just the stage. It's a flat stage. Well, so it's all supposed to be in your head, as it is in the mind of the old man. But in all the rest of the play, we've had lightning and wind, we've had bird songs, we've had all kinds of things. In this scene, there's no sound whatsoever. The directors decided, but there's still a little puddle of water from the rain scene because they couldn't drain the rain off the stage entirely. So again, because of those decisions, I was dropped out of the narrative when if they just trusted the text. So this is a long way of saying that there are elements that can disrupt the harmony, and not just disrupt for a moment with an atonality or a dissonance, but a disruption that takes time to then get back into the production. And that happens in art. Sometimes you do things you don't even realize you're doing on a canvas or with ink and pen and ink or whatever it happens to be. But there's an element that ends up being down in a corner, maybe a splatter of paint you didn't expect, but then you notice it. And you have to decide, is that drawing attention away from, or is it a color that is just a spot of the same color that happens in the upper edge of the painting, and so it's unifying it. So it can either be a disruption or it can be a unification. And that depends on the artist's judgment.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that, it's interesting because, harmony, this idea of, separate or constituent pieces creating a whole. Like you said, I think that there's always motion, right? And I think that as long as there's motion between the pieces, you'll have a harmony, whether it's pleasing or atonal or dissonant or whatever. But I think if you take away that property of the interaction between the elements, it's hard to say that you have harmony anymore.
Yeah.
Do you think a deterministic universe would be necessarily more harmonious than one with free will?
Yeah, you were just drinking the coffee. Would a deterministic universe be more harmonious than one with free will?
Necessarily more harmonious.
Necessarily. Well, oh man, do I want to wrestle with this? All right, so maybe intentionally, maybe the deterministic intent would be to make it more harmonious. I don't believe in an utterly deterministic universe. So I'm stepping aside from that because, of course, as philosophers, we consider all kinds of ideas. I can see a deterministic universe regimenting a society, a deterministic universe, limiting, of course, the number of choices one has of ways to live and so on. So there might be a regimentation that culture develops out of because we can't live in the middle of a desert. It's gotten too hot. We have to live somewhere else. I'm not even sure that's deterministic. Let's just say for a moment that it is. The anthropic principle works. Everything's been created for us to have a life on this world. And everything that we do is because of our genes and maybe our nurturance, the phylogenetics. And we put all of it together and we say, yep, I couldn't make any other decision than the one that I make. Well, can I make decisions that are harmonious? Yes. But are they absolutely creative and free? No. And in a universe in which free will operates, there's going to be a lot more. There'll be a lot more visible chaos, maybe. But there's still the possibility of a harmony because, again, all of the pieces that come together aren't meant to just be static and bland. They're meant to work together toward something larger.
Yeah, I think I have an interesting analogy for this from my studies, which is it'll tie into what we were talking about earlier. So when they talk about humans in a comparative fashion to other animals psychologically, they say humans there's a correlation, an inverse correlation between the plasticity of an organism's psychology and the rate of maturation. So it's called neoteny. And so with that, what they're saying is that if you have an animal and it's born, the quicker it gets to adulthood, the less diversified its behavior will be.
Yep.
And so as a result, humans, obviously the most psychologically plastic animal, right? You can put us in any type of situations and we'll react in novel ways. There'll be creativity in the way that we treat things. Whereas if you have an ant, right? An ant might be born essentially an adult, but it's going to have a limited number of behavioral and psychological things that it can do.
Yes.
It's context again, right? Because if that ant is operating in a context that works with the psychological and behavioral adaptations that have been passed on to it through its genetics, through its phylogeny, then it will act harmoniously. But if you have devastating climate change, right? All of a sudden you change the context that this ant is living in. It does not have the plasticity. It does not have the behavioral repertoire to change the way that it behaves in order to act harmoniously in the new context.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I think that that is sort of part of it. Now there's a huge trade-off there, right? The longer it takes you to grow up, the more vulnerable you are, right? But this idea of, is a deterministic universe necessarily more harmonious than a free will one? I don't think that that's a question you can answer, really, because it would depend on the nature of the deterministic universe. That's the context, right? So if we were to say that, okay, in this deterministic universe, there's an all-loving, all-powerful God that makes everything easy and pleasant for everybody, then sure, that deterministic universe is going to be necessarily more harmonious. But if you have a deistic universe, right, where some God came along and wanted to watch, or maybe there's an alien running a simulation that is going to watch you fail in order to learn how it can survive, or maybe there's nobody out there. It's just,
the existential universe.
Yeah, just the interaction of brains, and it's chaotic. It's chaotic in the sense that nobody's controlling it, but it's deterministic in the sense that everything is projecting from one point. I think that there's really an infinite number of ways in which to measure or conclude how harmonious a deterministic universe could be.
Yes.
So I think that I almost don't know if you can answer that question.
It's a universe. Well, I made the attempt because, after all, but I think you come to the same thing. Mathematically, things are going to emerge. And evolutionarily, things are going to emerge. Whether it was created to be that way, whether it just fell out that way, a harmony of a kind happens.
Yeah, that's an interesting theoretical question, right? If we think of harmony as being the interaction of either component or separate pieces that participate in movement, it makes you wonder how little you would actually need to have harmony, and what some of those universes could look like. These emergent properties. If you have emergent properties from mixing something as simple as oxygen and hydrogen, right? These things unite and have an emergent property that's harmonious. It makes you wonder what alternate universes could look like if you have different elements, different things that are...
Yes, because you could have a creature that evolves to a certain place and says, no, I like this. I don't want any more tools. I don't need anything else. We're just going to stifle ourselves at this point. We have this drive. We don't want harmony. I would argue that human beings ultimately do. We constantly wrestle against harmony.
Well, and that's interesting because, they say that that's part of the reason Neanderthals went extinct.
Yeah.
Was they obviously highly evolved. They had a higher brain mass than humans did. They were capable of language, capable of tool building. But eventually they reached a point where their technology stopped advancing. They reached a point and they said, no, this is good enough. And then humans overtook them. And that's an interesting psychological thing because, I think that, like I talked about earlier, evolutionary theories of psychology dominated during the latter parts of the 20th century. And now they're starting to find some flaws in them. But that part of that paradigm is this idea that, the forces of evolution are always acting on us, so we're always changing.
Yes.
It's not necessarily false, but what they're finding is that part of changing might be forcing yourself to stay the same. So it's this really strange paradoxical situation where, yeah, you're changing, but you're changing because you're not changing while the environment is changing. While selective pressures are saying you should be changing in order to address these, you're saying, no, I'm going to stay the same. And you'd think that Neanderthals or other extinct species would be a cautionary tale about the dangers of attempting to stay the same in a changing environment. I think humans are going to have to wrestle with this situation ourselves in the coming decades. But
that's really well said. I just was thinking of the word retirement when you were thinking about that. Does a group in the evolutionary chain retire? We love to make big about retirement in this culture, right? What's retirement? The dictionary says it's a state of being retired. Okay, great.
Very helpful.
But then there's withdrawal from one's position or occupation or from active working in life. Now listen to the biases built into that, the assumptions. Withdrawal, well, that can be done one way or another. There's many ways to be withdrawn from active working life. How dare anyone tell me that I'm not working, being a grandfather?
That sounds like the definition of death.
Doesn't it? From active working life. Okay, the Neanderthals retired. They had their golden years. They stopped. That's not harmonious.
Yeah. So this has been an interesting conversation. I appreciate you letting me beat up on you, because this whole conversation has just been a string of metaphors, essentially, because it's so abstract that trying to wrap your head around it and come to a way of understanding it is difficult. But I think that we did come to understand harmony a little bit better through all of the messy metaphors and the back and forth, which is that, it can be separate pieces. It can be component pieces. It involves a constant motion. There's unity in harmony, but the balance of the harmony and the pleasantness of it is going to depend on the situation that it's in. And, some of these bigger questions that lie outside of scientific ability to address them, that are philosophical in nature, are also a bit relativistic and are going to be difficult for us to answer, but are interesting to think about nonetheless.
Indeed.
So until next time, keep pondering.